Buenas tardes. Come on, let's take a ride. Welcome to La Habana, Cuba. This is From the Sanctioned Seat, Special Edition. Welcome. In this special edition of From the Sanctioned Seat, I want to take a step back from discussing legal travel to Cuba and discuss what's happening right now with the U.S. sanctions on Cuba. Specifically, what the Trump administration has done in the last few months to increase pressure onto the island. On January 29th, the administration declared a national emergency related to Cuba under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEEPA. Unlike the Trading with the Enemy Act, or TWEA, which underpins the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, remember our CACRs, and primarily governs U.S. persons, IEEPA instead provides authority to the United States to target foreign actors in third countries. On May 1st, President Trump issued an executive order titled 14404, creating the new IEEPA Cuba Sanctions Framework. A week later, on May 7th, CACR and Moa Nickel were the first sanctioned entities under the new IEEPA framework. That same day, OFAC issued General License Number 1, which clarified that the new executive order does not impair the current existing Cuban Assets Control Regulations. The executive order did not simply add another Cuba rule. It introduced a whole new layer of sanctions pressure. In other words, the older Cuba embargo framework under TWEA and the CACRs continue to operate as they have been. But now the Executive Order 14404 adds an IEEPA-based layer on top of it. My name is Melisa Rivière. I'm an anthropologist and a certified sanctions specialist. Usually this program we dedicate it to better understanding U.S. sanctions on Cuba, to break down legal travel to Cuba. But I think that we deserve a special edition dedicated to what is happening right now, to the Executive Order 14404, in order to understand the evolving Cuba sanctions architecture we're facing today. We believe that this should be the home of From the Sanctioned Seat because these are the relics of the past that symbolize U.S. sanctions on Cuba. If modern supply chains existed, there wouldn't be about 70 to 80,000 of these antique 1950s cars still on the road today. And a fun fact, before 1959, there was a daily ferry called City of Havana as its destination that departed Key West every single day and brought these cars. Tourists from the United States would come with their cars to spend long weekends in Havana, and many of them would leave their cars behind or sell them to locals. Many of these cars that are on the road of Cuba today didn't come in containers or shipping boats. They came by ferry, a daily ferry called City of Havana from Key West. Before we discuss what has changed, we need to clearly understand what already existed. For decades, the core of U.S. Cuba sanctions operated under TWEA, or the Trading with the Enemy Act. The CACRs, the Cuban Asset Control Regulations, are the legal framework that has long governed U.S. Cuba-related transactions involving people and entities subject to U.S. jurisdiction. In simple terms, this usually includes U.S. citizens, U.S. residents, people physically present in the United States, U.S. companies, their employees, foreign branches of U.S. companies, and entities owned and controlled by U.S. persons. We looked into this in a previous episode of From the Sanctioned Seat when we discussed who must comply with U.S. sanctions. The traditional framework largely focused on the conduct of people who are under U.S. jurisdiction. The embargo also had its extraterritorial effects because Cuba-related restrictions reached third country supply chains when Cuban origin goods entered U.S. commerce. Let's look at an example, like Cuban nickel. Mercedes-Benz could not enter their cars into the U.S. market if those cars contained Cuban nickel. The risk was connected to the product entering U.S. commerce. The focus was on the Cuban origin of the product itself. So that remains intact today. It's still relevant under the ongoing embargo of the United States against Cuba. However, now the question is not only whether the Cuban origin product enters the United States market, but now there's many more questions that affect sanctions risk, such as who is financing the product, who is insuring the product, who is shipping the product, who is investing in it, who is processing the payments, who are its global commercial relationships. So the traditional U.S. embargo on Cuba focused on the Cuban origin product, but Executive Order 14404 now expands sanction risks to all the companies, the banks, the investors, the insurers, the shipping firms, and all the international networks and touch points that touch that product. So on January 29, President Trump issued an executive order titled 14380. It declared a national emergency related to Cuba under IEEPA. Then, on May 1st, President Trump issued the executive order 14404. This second executive order built on the national emergency related to Cuba to create a new Cuba sanctions program, a new framework. The key legal authority here is IEEPA. TWEA is the foundation of the older Cuba sanctions framework. IEEPA is the foundation of the new executive orders being implemented today and since January of 2026. Both are now interlayered with each other. So the CACRs, the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, general licenses, the prohibitions and the permissions, they're all still in effect. O sea, legal travel to Cuba is still legal travel to Cuba. That's all still in place. But the Executive Order 14404, it adds a second layer. And this second layer doesn't just focus on those who are under U.S. jurisdiction. This second layer focuses on all the foreign actors who are providing goods, services, financing, investment, insurance, logistics, technology to Cuban entities that the United States has now targeted. The United States cannot force a Canadian company to obey U.S. foreign policy as if it were an American company, but it can restrict the Canadian company's access to the U.S. financial system if it continues business with a sanctioned Cuban entity. And that's why secondary sanctions are so powerful. They work because so much of the world's financial system intersects with the United States and, more specifically, with the U.S. dollar. For many multinational companies, losing access to those systems is not a minor inconvenience. It can be decisive to their existence. But before we go further, maybe we need to ask a very basic question and unpackage what is a sanction. Most people think that a sanction is a fine, and sometimes fines are involved in sanctions enforcement. But being sanctioned is not the same thing as being fined. A fine is a penalty that you pay. A sanctions designation is more like being completely cut off. If OFAC designates a company, a person, an entity as a specially designated national, or what's called an SDN, then two things happen. First, U.S. persons are generally prohibited from any business transactions with that entity, unless, of course, OFAC authorizes the transaction. But second, and perhaps most importantly, any and all property and interests in property of that entity that come within U.S. jurisdiction are blocked. They are completely frozen, access withdrawn. The entity cannot access those assets without OFAC authorization. So banks begin debanking. Insurers back away. Shipping companies refuse to transport. Even companies that are not directly prohibited often decide that the risk is far too high. Because nobody wants to become the next target or to be expelled from the U.S. global financial system. And that is the practical and political power of sanctions. So, what is the difference between the Cuba Restricted List and the SDN List, or the Specially Designated Nationals? So many people hear that an entity is restricted, sanctioned, listed, blocked, And they assume all of those words mean the same thing, but they're not. The Cuba Restricted List and the SDN List are very different. They're not the same. Let's start with the Cuba Restricted List, or sometimes referred to as the CRL. The CRL is administered by the U.S. State Department, and it's connected with the Cuban Assets Control Regulations, or the CACRs. It identifies entities and sub-entities that the U.S. government has determined to be under the control of or acting on behalf of the Cuban military, and it prohibits financial transactions with these entities unless, of course, you have a specific license from OFAC in order to do so. The focus of financial transactions is by persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction, and that's very important. So now let's look at the SDN list. The SDN list is administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Controls, or OFAC, and it's much wider than just Cuba. In fact, it involves sanctions of entities and persons from all over the world, and it identifies persons or entities that have been designated by OFAC as a blocked person. When OFAC places a person or a company on the SDN list, it's much more elaborate than the very specific CACR Cuba Restricted Entities list for those under U.S. jurisdiction. That means that people that are under U.S. jurisdiction are prohibited from dealing with anyone on the SDN list, and any of their properties that are under U.S. jurisdiction are blocked. Under Executive Order 14404, foreign persons and financial institutions may also face sanctions if they engage in transactions involving blocked persons or entities. One list primarily regulates financial transactions by persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction. That's the Cuba Restricted Entities list. The other isolates the target from the international U.S. financial system entirely. So I want to take a look at a case study. I want to look at the Moa Nickel case study so that we can see how the old Cuba sanctions framework and the new executive orders layer upon each other. Moa Nickel is part of Cuba's nickel and cobalt industry. Nickel and cobalt are used to make steel, they're used to make batteries, they're used in the automotive manufacturing, and in everyday household electronics. And Moa has a long history of joint business ventures with Canada's Sherritt International. For years, we understood the U.S. sanctions question primarily through the older embargo framework, which was, will Cuban origin nickel enter the U.S. market? And if it will, then it would be sanctioned. But after Executive Order 14404, the analysis becomes even broader. We have to ask, who is shipping the nickel? Who's transporting it? Who's investing in the nickel? Who's processing the payments? And who provided equipment or technology or services? Who provided commercial support? Even if it's not a U.S. destination, all of these players now face sanctions exposure. On May 7th, when the U.S. placed Moa on the SDN list, Sherritt International announced that it had suspended its direct participation in the joint venture and began removing personnel from Cuba. The company stated that the mere issuance of the executive order altered its ability to operate in Cuba, and that could affect all of its businesses worldwide. Then, on May 19th, Sherritt announced that it had entered into a possible buyout or takeover with U.S.-based Gillen Capital. Gillen Capital pertains to Ray Washburn, who served as advisor to President Trump in his first term. The proposed Gillen Capital investment is for a majority of Sherritt's common shares. This would represent a controlling position if completed and would require OFAC authorization to continue mining resources in Cuba through Moa Nickel. So we should ask, is U.S. foreign policy working towards removing foreign actors in order to replace them? If certain investors leave because Cuba becomes too risky for them, could other investors enter with U.S. government authorization? Could sanctions reshape not only who exits Cuba, but who is allowed to enter under different terms? Sanctions would then seem to be used not only to prohibit transactions, but actually to reshape markets. And if this is the case, sanctions pressure is not only discouraging foreign participation in Cuba, but then creating conditions in which specially authorized U.S. actors could enter the same resource markets, but under more favorable terms. And, well, we'd want to ask, more favorable for whom? So, what are your key takeaways from today's From the Sanctioned Seat special edition? Well, first, that the traditional Cuban embargo under TWEA, the CACRs, those remain in place. That the executive order 14404 did not replace these, but instead added a new IEEPA-based sanctions layer on top of the existing Cuban sanction architecture. Number two, that the traditional embargo focused heavily on U.S. jurisdiction and Cuban origin goods entering U.S. markets. But Executive Order 14404 expands sanctions risks to the international networks that support Cuban businesses worldwide. Takeaway number three, that the Cuba Restricted Entities List and the SDN List are not the same thing. The Cuba Restricted Entities List prohibits financial transactions by persons subject to U.S. jurisdiction, whereas the SDN List completely blocks the target, freezes their assets throughout the entire U.S. global financial system, and creates broader sanctions exposure to anyone who engages with them. And your key takeaway number four? Well, that the CACR general licenses for legal travel to Cuba remain in place. And I can think of no better time to travel to Cuba than today. So reach out to Son Dos Alas so that we can plan your upcoming Cuba trip. Until the next episode of From the Sanctioned Seat.